All right. Happy Tuesday, everybody. We're here today to speak with Jeff Mello from Bootleg Biology. I'm pretty excited about this. I've been toying around with some of the bootleg biology yeast cultures, and I will be contributing to a project that Jeff is embarking on to catalog local yeast cultures, something I'm very excited about. People who listen to the, what are these called, video casts, you know how excited I get about local shit, and it's like, I want that, you know. I love the regionality of beer, and so Jeff's really onto something that I think is going to change the way people brew at home, and hopefully breweries, professional breweries, approach brewing. So without further ado, how do you do, Jeff?
Hey, how's it going, Marco? Thanks for having me on the program or chatting with me. This is fun.
We're going to have, I hope, a great time. If nothing else, we're going to speak about a lot of things that you are doing. So it's going to be the pat yourself on the back hour. But I kind of, there you go. See, that'll get you through anything. Before we get into what bootleg biology really is, I think I want to learn a little bit more, so people can learn a little bit more about you and your background in brewing, and kind of where bootleg biology came from and why this is a legitimate thing and people should be paying attention to. And so I guess if you want to start, where did your love affair with beer and brewing and yeast begin?
I mean, it's pretty similar to a lot of people. You know, I was a home brewer for multiple years. I was a fundraising consultant in DC. I live in Nashville now, but I lived in DC for numerous years. And I was kind of just burned out on the life. And I just made a decision with my wife that it was more important to be healthy overall mentally and quit my job. Didn't know what to do with my life. I read Mike Tunsmeyer, the Mad Fermentationist article he had in Brew Your Own about doing wild yeast starter jars, so how to do like a lambic fermentation, but kind of a safer way of capturing local cultures instead of just brewing a 5-gallon batch and doing small sample starters and picking the ones you like best and then using that to pitch into your beer. So I experimented with that. I put several mason jars in my backyard, my garden. And they were pretty disgusting. They were horrible. They grew layers of mold on them. I didn't really know what I was doing. But 2 of them actually smelled kind of good. I thought there was some potential there. So there was some kind of fun yeast living in there. It kind of smelled like honey, floral. So I kind of went to the University of Google and tried to learn how to make agar plates and isolate yeast. I had never had done any of those things. I was a poli-sci major in college, didn't have any background in the sciences, and kind of struck gold, I think. On my first try, I isolated what I call S. arlingtonensis, since I lived in Arlington, which is a suburb of DC. And that yeast strain was amazing. It's like kind of hybrid lager, kind of Kolsch type yeast. It does really well at cool temperatures, makes a very clean tasting beer, produces some kind of like subtle sulfur elements, but those kind of burn off with time, and really just great for those kind of hybrid type beers. And so after that, I was like, I'm on. This is it. This is my life. This is what I'm doing. This is my mission. I met my wife for lunch, and I was like, bootleg biology. We're doing it. We're starting a yeast company. If I can do this without any professional experience, anyone can do it. I mean, really. Yeah. And so I wanted to teach other people how to culture yeast. And with some basic, simple techniques. And so that's what I really started working on, building out bootlegbiology.com and the DIY yeast section, how to find the cultures, how to make your own agar plates, how to isolate yeast, and kind of how to generally determine what's good, what's safe. You know, that's one of the biggest questions. You know, how do I know what I have, and how do I know it's safe to drink and brew with? And just kind of answer those questions and be a free resource to homebrewers who want to do something similar, who want to, you know, find something from their backyard, you know, and increase the likelihood that it's going to be something yummy and fun. and hopefully something that teaches people basic science too. I mean, that's a big part of it too. Is like I think a lot of people have interest in science, but think that it's way beyond their skill set. But I mean, if you're a brewer, you understand chemistry, you understand microbiology, you understand engineering to some extent. Like if you can do all these things, I mean, even if you're just a cook, you can make beer and you can isolate your own yeast strain that you found in your backyard, and that's kind of what we've been focusing on since day one.
So a lot of stuff in there, and a lot of questions in my mind. And what I like that you said you were a political science major, and so was I. And so I am, I consider myself to be completely inept at the sciences, other than political science really isn't a science.
It's not. I don't even know how you get away with calling it a science.
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't even know what it really is, but I'm definitely not a scientist, definitely not a chemist, definitely not a biologist. And so it's intriguing for me to kind of figure out that, or it was interesting for me to figure out that I could do this in my own backyard as well. And that there's some really cool stuff you can do. This epiphany you had with Arlingtonesis, it was like a sudden thing. It was like, this just happened because I came up with a great yeast culture, and I said, ha, light bulb went off. It was not like there was nothing it was really just like a 1 second to the next thing.
I mean, I guess it's, to me, I think having the liberal arts background meant that I was, I guess, willing to always learn. I guess that's always kind of been my thing. Even when I was working my professional career, every homebrewer can relate to this. It's like, once you get excited about it, you just really dive in deep. I mean, how many people have 15 brewing books, that they've bought, or, how many podcasts they listen to or blogs they read, Craft Commander. I mean, this is part of growing your knowledge, and everyone wants to get better at what they're doing. And so for me, I've always kind of just really, once I found something I was interested in, I just dug in deep. And so something like this, while it was, way beyond my skill set to, just isolate yeast at that point, and I even think that I could even start a yeast company without, no, I've never even been in a lab.
Right.
It's a very audacious goal, and I didn't have a job, so you can be quite ambitious when you don't have anywhere to go but up. But also too, just in general, just I think I was at a point in my life where I felt comfortable working my ass off on trying to learn and then build something, and then also being willing to be patient about it. I think I couldn't have done that without my wife kind of being on board with that too. I think she saw the potential too. It was kind of bizarre for her that what I was doing, but when she saw the end results that we actually made a beer with yeast that we pulled from our backyard, I think she saw the potential for that, and really just wanted me to run with it because it was fun and exciting. And in the end, it's about making beer, and everyone likes beer, and so as long as you can make good beer, then just go for it.
Did you spend time in any professional breweries, kind of perfecting the skill and kind of like the art of using this yeast, the art of manipulating yeast, or was it all from homebrewing experience?
It was all from homebrewing, really. I mean, I definitely follow people on social media, read books, try to learn as much as I can. But really, for the most part, most of my practical experience in this has just been from homebrewing.
Yeah.
And then just trying to dig deep in microbiology, reading. Yeast was a big one for me as a home brewer, and I think that was part of the excitement too. Is I had read Yeast by Chris White, and it really opened my eyes on what the potential of yeast was too. Because that was always my favorite part of the brewing experience, because it's the one thing that's actually alive when you use it for brewing. And so there's really just so many things that you can learn and make your beer different just because of the yeast. And so that book really makes you. It really, I think, challenges your interest in homebrewing if you can get to that book. It's like, do I really like homebrewing so much to read this entire book about yeast? Because it's so technical at times. But really, that kind of became my Bible on how to, culture yeast for brewing purposes. So that was a big one. And then just beyond there, just learning or reading more, textbooks about yeast and those kind of things, and just really just asking a lot of questions. I think like what you're doing with Craft Commander, asking the brewer, what do you do in these scenarios? Like, you're a home brewer, you've brewed IPAs, you've brewed sour beers, but everyone else has a different way of doing something, and even scientists do too. There's some basic things like making plates and isolating yeast that's pretty standard across the way, but every scientist has a different way they like doing something, achieving a goal, and just asking around. And part of the reasoning behind the name Bootleg Biology was teaching people these science skills and determining what tools you could use in your own home to essentially use science.
Sure.
Bootleg, it's bootstrapping. That's part of the goal of the website is, there really aren't any specialized tools that you need. Most things you can find in your kitchen. There's a few things you can't, but most things you can find in your kitchen. And that's the point, is that there shouldn't be a huge barrier to entry in doing these kind of things. And so that's also part of the Bootleg mission, is teaching people what you can do with just some everyday items. And I kind of asked some scientists, I was like, what would you do in your own home? If you didn't have fancy tools to, isolate yeast or prop yeast, what would you use? And I took a microbiology class here in Nashville, and the professor, he loved it. He loved beer. He wasn't a home brewer, but he loved answering these kind of questions. He was like, well, I would kind of create my own laminar flow hood, but with just a box. And so there you go. My first laminar flow hood was just a cabinet that I bought from Walmart. And really it achieved the goal of creating a space that I could do isolating of yeast and feel comfortable with it. So this is things like that.
Cool. And, something one of the reasons I asked is because, what's beautiful about what's happening now in America is that so much innovation is coming out of people's houses. A lot of times the professional breweries that we have been influenced by, inspired by, they get too big. That's not a bad thing. What I mean by too big is they get too big to experiment as much as someone like you or I could at our house, right? So where we can brew 30-gallon batch or one barrel and split it 6 different ways, and try different things, they just can't do that anymore. And so I love that the industry is learning from people like yourself, and really and professional brewers are latching onto the idea of bootleg biology. You can see that all over the internet, and really kind of embracing this, what you're doing, this local yeast banking, this kind of specialized bootleg biology for all intents and purposes. Not to be cheesy, it's awesome. And I'll say it once, I'll say it again. Said it once, I'll say it again. I'll say it forever. Home brewing to me right now is the single most important thing to the survival and the continued growth of craft beer. The more people get in touch with what goes into the beer they're drinking at a professional, they go to the store and buy a bottle of beer.
Yep. The
more people are in touch with what it took for the brewer to put into that bottle.
Yep.
The more they'll appreciate it, and the more I think the industry will stick around. I always use wine as a reference. People are so into how the vines are grown, what soils are used, what side of the mountain, how did the wind come around the mountain and influence these grapes? And so thanks to people like you, we're getting people interested in, well, okay, I used the same exact grain bill I did last time. I fermented the same temperature,
Yep.
But because I used the yeast culture that I pulled off of, and I'll use mine for example, rosemary and papaya flower versus the garden flowers that are used to attract butterflies, I got a completely different beer. And so you're going to this, again, cheesy catch term, but terroir, and you're really embracing and creating that culture. So we keep talking about what people can use in their house to go through this process, but I know that Bootleg Biology, you guys sell a kit.
Yeah.
And I see it over your shoulder. Do you want to go through what that kit has and how it helps people?
Yeah, so the Backyard Yeast Wrangling Toolkit is really designed for, people who want to kind of get everything together. We designed everything that you would need to make agar plates, isolate yeast, and put it all in one jar, just to make it simple. And I think, you know, a lot of the stuff you could source on your own, on your own, you know, you get just exactly what you need on a homebrew level to do some of these things. So it has auger plates. It has a special blend that we've created of auger. It has pipettes, sterile tubes, sterile swabs. So a lot of the things you need to just go and get the cultures out in the wild. So, you know, haven't gotten into that yet, but, you know, there's so many ways of trying to find a culture. And you mentioned flowers, which is a huge thing. Fruits, you know, a lot of people just assume that you can only do kind of a lambic style thing where you're putting wort outside. That's totally a great way of finding cultures, but it's not the only way. And things like sterile swabs make it really portable. You know, every time we go on vacation, you know, I always bring a ton of sterile swabs and sterile test tubes. So if we go on a hike somewhere, I can swab a flower or something unique and just stick it in our pocket. And then, you know, when I get home a few days later, then I can start playing with it. And so it's really not something you gotta hike around with a big jar of worts to capture a yeast. It's not necessary at all, you know. So things like that. And, you know, instruction booklet. And I think one of the most important elements is an envelope where you can actually send your culture into us, you know. And I think that's probably the biggest value, other than the actual items in the yeast wrangling toolkit, is that if you send your culture to us, if it's not isolated, we'll isolate it out. We'll grow it up, make sure that it can ferment out a beer, and then we'll permanently bank it in our freezer as part of the local yeast project. So you brought that up. So the local yeast project is our goal, or is our, you know, endeavor to capture yeast from every zip code in the entire country, and really the world too. But we're starting with, you know, focusing on any zip code we can get in the U.S. And then banking it, and then trying to study and understand it. And so if anyone contributes to the local yeast project, they'll have their culture permanently banked, and then we can prop it at any time for them. And so a lot of people, you know, have participated so far. You know, they'll send a culture that they haven't even isolated yet, and they'll just send it to us in the mail. We'll isolate it, send it back to them, because there's also a one-to-one exchange. You know, if you send us a culture, we'll send you something back. So you may not want an isolated culture, or you could have something else from our bank, whether it's another local yeast from a different area, something we've released commercially, since we have homebrew pitches that we sell. So really, it's a way for now you to learn how to capture yeast, how to culture it, isolate it, but then once you become a part of the local yeast project by sending us the culture, really it's become something even bigger. You know, we list your name on our website, and then we're also partnering with a geneticist at the University of Washington to really dig deep into the genetics of the yeasts. Something that's beyond our capabilities, but they can actually look at the entire genome of these yeasts and at the very least understand what species it is, but then how it's related to other yeast. So a lot of really cool things that, you know, you can be a part of, and it's not just about making beer. It's kind of contributing to science, and you know, in any way, like, I think the most important part of it is just, you know, learning how to make a tasty beer from something from your backyard. Mm-hmm. You know, that's the biggest goal, and you can do that with the kit. And, you know, I get all kinds of random questions all the time about how to use the kit or how to do any of these things, and, you know, I'm here to help, you know. So
I love that idea. I love everything you just said. I love, but I really, really, really love the idea of this local yeast bank. I like I may have said earlier, I'm contributing to it. I can't wait to be a part of that. It's a really cool thing to be a part of. And it's funny you said, I'm happy you said the world, because it's funny, the more I look at like the website analytics, I have a huge amount of people that watch this in the UK and in Japan.
Nice.
I don't know where that comes from, but hopefully you get some of their yeast too.
That would be, I mean, anywhere where people are interested in craft beer, I think there's a, you know, it may not be as developed in the U.S. as in the U.S., but, like, you know, people are learning about homebrewing. There's a big, you know, homebrewing scene in the U.K., Australia, obviously Canada, Scandinavia is huge too. We get a lot of requests from that. We actually had Lee from Thailand. He lived in Thailand, and he cultured yeast off a wild Thai pepper, and he sent that to us. He just stuck it in the mail, it took 2 weeks to get here, but it actually survived. We cultured it up and isolated all the cultures and sent it back to him. So
Very cool.
really, it's a global project because, you know, we want to focus on things that are hyper local, but we're also part of a global community. And, you know, any way we can, you know, help others learn and, you know, grow our bank, you know, definitely more the merrier.
Really cool. Really cool. So I kind of want to go into a little bit of the technicality behind harvesting yeast.
Yeah.
And so I guess the first general question is, I mean, the kit I think is an amazing way to start. It gives you an instruction booklet, gives access to tons of resources. I mean, you have all the stuff there, so it gives you it gives the ability to ask you targeted questions on what's going on, and you have a familiarity with your kit. You can get back to people with answers specific to what's going on with the actual materials they need and they have based on what you've given them.
Yep.
But do you need auger plates? I mean, there's plenty of methods. I know that you're a believer in the auger plates, but people can pull yeast off of things different ways, right, in their house if they want to.
Yeah, I mean, the auger is really, the whole goal of the auger is to get a pure culture, and that doesn't mean that has to be your goal. You know, a lot of people love just working with mixed cultures, mixed fermentation. I think a lot of people are looking at what Jester King is doing right now and just really, you know, A, loving the beer because it's awesome, but also B, really enjoying the process that they're focusing on capturing local cultures and letting that guide their brewing, and then letting the brewing guide the microbes. I mean, you know, if you have a hoppy beer from them, the flavor profile is actually very different from something else. You know, I've looked at some of the microbes in these Jester King beers, and what's in you know, hoppy beer is different from what's in some of the other beers. So, you know, their brewing is changing the microbes as much as the microbes is changing what the final product is. So it's this cool symbiotic relationship that is totally cool. And it, you know, a pure culture doesn't have to be your goal. You know, for us, it's, you know, it's easier to learn about the cultures that are within it. You know, if you isolate them, because it's kind of a scientific method, is to pull them apart and look what they do by themselves. But I think we all can appreciate mixed fermentations and the beauty of that, and what lambic, you know, brewers have been doing for centuries, and how that as itself is so difficult to make an awesome beer with a mixed fermentation, especially when you're not even like pitching something like bottle dregs or a commercial culture. If you're just going out there and solely just capturing cultures that have been floating in from the air, I think so many people know that, you know, it's not a guaranteed success when you do it that way.
Right.
So that doesn't have to be, you know, your end goal. So if you were to go out there and just get, you know, yeast from flowers, and say you pitch it into a small batch of beer, and it ferments out fully, it's like a few tests you want to do to make sure that it's A, successful, and B, you know, safe, is that it ferments out fully. You know, it drops the gravity to something like below 1010 or something. You know, it drops the pH into a typical beer range, you know, in the 4s or lower. And then just the basic stuff like produces CO2, you know, throw it into a container that with an airlock. And then once you start seeing airlock activity, that's a plus, because really a lot of pathogens that you can avoid won't grow in an anaerobic environment. So those kind of things. And so at that point in time, if you like what that beer's produced, you know, just repitch that slurry over and over again. And there you go. You have a local culture. And you know, that yeast is something that's yours and it's unique. And then you could send that mixed culture to us, and then if you want, we can isolate it out and send you back the isolates to play with on an individual level. Just to give an example, this beer I'm drinking right now is from John Hawking. He's actually from Tacoma, Washington, where I grew up. And he set some wort outside on his balcony near Commencement Bay. So got a mixed culture. He sent us that culture, and then I isolated out, sent him back to isolate, and he made an amazing wit beer with this. This is
very cool.
Perfect wit beer yeast was just captured from, you know, wort that was sitting on his balcony. So this goes to show you that you can make a cool mixed fermentation beer, and then you can pull an isolate out and make a cool Belgian style beer as well. So
that's really cool. So I guess let's talk a little bit about the process. I know a lot of people are interested in doing this, and I feel like they want to hear maybe the most successful approach, you know, and so I guess the first question, so like I said earlier, I did this recently at my house, and then so the people that I know that I brew with or that are friends that brew down here have asked me kind of how'd you go about selecting the items?
Yep.
So do you have any advice to people first and foremost on how to select an item to pull yeast off of?
Yeah, I mean, even going beyond that, I get a lot of questions on what time of year. I think a lot of people think that you have to stick to the lambic calendar, and they have very specific reasons why they only brew in the cold months, and a lot of that has to do with reducing the number of lactic acid bacteria in that beer. And really, the best time of year is when things are alive and growing. Spring to fall, when it's warm outside, that's the best time. And then, things that are going to be visited by insects, pollinators, flowers are great. You can actually take a whole flower and dunk it in wort, or you could use a sterile swab from the yeast wrangling toolkit and just swab some of the pollen and then dunk that in some wort. Fruit is a big one, and I think as I've been doing this for a few years now, you're gonna get the biggest bang for your buck with fruit. Fruit you see a light dusting on, blueberries, raspberries, something small you can just dunk into some wort. 9 times out of 10 you're going to see some level of fermentation.
You want something organic, because the pesticide, like if something that's not organic may have pesticides or other sprays on it. Does that affect the ability to produce usable culture?
I mean, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, some of these companies are spraying fungicides on them, and so that it's possible that it could kill the yeast. So organic would certainly be best. I mean, in general, if you're going to use any kind of fruit or anything in your brewing, I would stick to that. So most people in their backyard or friends have that kind of resource, or if you're just going out on a hike somewhere, something you just find growing in the wild, blackberries or whatever, that's definitely a great source. So that's increasing your likelihood of success, but that's not saying you can't stick wort outside. That tons of options for finding wild cultures, and what we find in yeast that was fell into some wort is probably different from what we found on flowers. And that's part of the thing, is it's still so early in our study of the local yeast project. We really have hundreds of cultures that we're working with this geneticist and looking at, and that's part of our goal, is to look at what's growing on what makes a yeast growing on a flower different from fruit or just floating in the air and those kind of things.
Sure.
So that's the basic. Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
But I mean, that's the basic thing, is like, when do you do it, and then where? Sticking wort outside, flowers, fruits, and if they're too large to say stick in some worts, use a sterile swab and just swab the outside. I had a friend who went to the French Quarter in New Orleans and swabbed the outsides of buildings. I did not have high expectations for that, but he found a yeast and we isolated it out and it brewed beer. So it just goes to say, we call it quarter pump. It's places not to look are the insides of buildings. You need to look for outside places where yeast can grow on a substrate. That's the most important thing. I mean, a lot of people think of like lambic buildings. These are old buildings with cobwebs, and really they aren't good sources of yeast. So there's not a high chance of finding something. So those kind of things. And so beyond that, so once you find something, you want to make sure that you found some yeast and then it's safe. And so talking about doing a test fermentation, throwing into a small amount of wort in a container with an airlock, and just making sure that it drops the gravity, drops pH, you see CO2 activity, and then you're good to go. And then beyond that, if you want to isolate a culture with the backyard yeast wrangling toolkit, we do have sterile plates and agar mix, and it's really simple. All you have to do is mix the agar with hot water and then pour that into plates and then let them sit. And if you're not familiar with agar, really it's a source from seaweed. It's kind of like gelatin. Once you mix it with something, it sets. So I mean, a lot of like cooks use it to like make foods that are like almost like Jello, but are actually vegan. So make a plate, and then you try to get a small amount of sample that you captured and then streak it on that plate. It's actually super easy. You know, it's really about taking a lot of cells and then trying to dilute it to a point where you have a single cell. And if you haven't seen a plate before, you can go on our website and go to the micro portrait gallery. When you have a pure culture, you'll see a single colony on that plate. It's usually white, maybe off-white, a little bit of yellow. And you pick up that yeast colony and stick it in some wort, and there you go. You have a little starter of pure yeast. So it's really simple. I mean, you could spend hours talking about the details of doing all those things, but at that point, you know, make beer. You know, and you're talking about test batches, and I think test batches are a great way of determining what you like. You know, because a simple test is, can I make beer? But then also, well, do you like the beer? So people often ask me, what kind of beer should I use as a test? Here we actually just make extract beers. We just get the Pilsen Light extracts.
Sure.
Throw a tiny bit of hops in there just for some basic level of hop flavor and some IBUs. And then that's it. You know, we really want to make the most boring beer possible, so that the yeast shines through. That everything you're getting from that really should be derived from the yeast. And you can learn a ton. I mean, if you see several test batches next to each other, it's amazing the difference. Whether it's the flocculation, you know.
Oh yeah.
And you can look at a chart from the big yeast lab, and they'll talk about, you know, how flocculent it is. But when you compare it side by side, it's amazing how flocculent you know, different strains are. I mean, and then different colors.
On my two strains, it's been so cool to see how like the rosemary and papaya start off real slow, and then the flowers started off real slow, but then all of a sudden, it's just like boom, all this activity. But one was super flocculent, the other one was really cloudy. It's been really cool to kind of see that, and I think it helps you from a brewing perspective. You get to really know what the yeast is. I guess taking a step back, or not what the yeast is and what it will produce for you, but I guess taking a step back, is there a certain gravity level that you want to start with if you use wort to capture yeast, or when you're pulling the yeast strain into wort for the first time, start stepping it up as a starter? Is there do you want to stay with a lower gravity? Do you have any recommendation on that for people who are going through this process?
Yeah, totally. I would say if you're, you know, doing say you're sticking wort outside, or you're doing kind of your first test batch of something you captured, I would say 1040 wort, you know, something that's high enough where the alcohol produced is going to kill most any other microbe in there, and then give you a sense of if it's able to ferment out a beer. You know, a lot of local yeast is actually highly attenuative. It's usually more attenuative than Cerevisiae. And so you see a lot of times a beer that'll ferment out to 0. And so you can go from there. You know, 1040 isn't a very high gravity. So if you really want to understand the kind of ABV tolerance of these yeast, I'd probably go at a minimum to 1060. So start off with something a little bit lower, so you just get a sense of what it's able to do. And that's a simple test of, you know, did it just get to 1020? Well, it's probably not going to make a very good beer if it can't really ferment out that much. And then, you know, grow it up to something higher. Give it a chance to adapt to the beer environment. That's the other thing too, is like, you know, it's not used to making beer. And so if it can make beer, that's great. But you kind of have to nurse it along a little bit into that environment. And so, you know, stepping it up from 1040 to 1060 is good. When we go from an auger plate where we've got a pure culture, we actually take that single colony and put it into 10 mils of 1020 gravity worts. So really, the first time after we've isolated the culture and we put it into wort, we do a lower gravity wort so that it's kind of eased into the process. You know, it's not shocked by the osmotic pressure of all these sugars in there, and that's something that, you know, can affect the ability.
It's like acclimating a fish to a fish tank. A little bit of tank water. Yeah, same kind of deal. So I mean, that's kind of what I did. So I'm happy you said that, because Vindicated. I had a lot of help. I had help from Gus Atkinson, the Farmhouse Obsession. He really helped me out a whole hell of a lot through this process. I was like,
this is awesome.
yeah, he's a great guy. All right, so we talked about the wort, what kinds of things we want to do to step it up. So I guess some of the sensory we can see it obviously if it's in a clear container, and we can smell it obviously if we just pull the airlock or the aluminum foil off the top. So I guess before we taste it, we want to take a pH, like you said, and a gravity reading to make sure that we have something that's fermented out and is safe. Those are the considerations. That CO2. That's the other question people ask a lot. CO2, pH in the 4s or below, and gravity. A full fermentation. So once we've done that, we can take what's nice about doing it this way is that it's not like you've brewed this massive amount of wort, you throw it outside like in your makeshift cool ship, and you've wasted an entire brew day. It's a process that allows you to kind of eliminate things, and you're spending a week, 2 weeks waiting for this to kind of fully happen. So that's the big advantage I see of doing it your way and using one of your kits to kind of do this, is that you can really kind of like isolate and figure out what you want to use in a bigger batch of beer before wasting a bigger batch of beer on something that tastes like shit, or is dangerous and will kill you.
Well, I think also too is like lambic brewers have a huge lag time with their beers, and a lot of that is because the number of cells is so low, it takes forever for that yeast to divide enough to get to a point where it can actually ferment out a beer. And so that's part of the thing is, growing it up, training it for beer, those kind of two elements of getting it ready for the big time of making a homebrew batch for you. And with that, I think you definitely increase your chances of, liking the product that you end up with, instead of wasting all your time on a 5-gallon batch that goes wrong.
Sure. And so something that I didn't mention in the beginning, but kind of I feel like we're leading into it a little bit, is this is part 1 of 2 conversations we're going to have. These are going to go up on the brewing section of the website, and the second part I think is going to be a much shorter conversation potentially. But so part of what I did prior to this conversation, you can see some of the pictures on Instagram. I have some more. If people want to see them, I can put some pictures up. But I brewed a simple, low IBU saison that I kind of the grain bill I use for a lot of the saisons, Pilsner and wheat. And I tested Funk Weapon 1 and Funk Weapon 2 side by side. The name's right, Funk Weapon.
Yep.
So it's 2, and I guess you can go into what Funk Weapon 1 and what Funk Weapon 2 are, more biological terminology. But so I brewed this batch, I split it, and I'm fermenting right now. It went absolutely crazy, airlock blowing up and everything. With these 2 yeast strains, we're going to come back and revisit them and show how, side by side, these 2 cultures that you can get at Bootleg Biology produce different flavors, different things, and also talk about how Brettanomyces does not sour the beer. And so I was very tempted to throw some bacteria in there, but I said, you know what? Another point that I can say, look, it's not sour, and there's a reason for that.
Yep.
Something. So
Brandon Jones from Embrace the Funk in Nashville, it's part of Yazoo Brewing, is they have a beer called Brett Not Sour, just to make that point even more so.
Yeah. So I was part of a Fooder for Thought this last year at Green Bench, and I interviewed, Brandon, Avery and Sean from Jester King, and Corey over at Side Project. And one of the things I kept asking all of them was that question, and you should see the looks on their faces when they had to explain again that I was hosting this conversation thing, so there was a bunch of people listening, and I was like, Brett is not souring the beers, right? And then finally, people were like, oh.
I mean, there's always an asterisk for that, because Brett can produce acetic acid in the presence of oxygen, But then brewers are usually like, well, if your Brett is producing a bunch of acetic acid, and that's what making the beer sour, then you're probably doing something wrong.
Right. So there's always an asterisk, but maybe acidic, tart, but not sour. You know, soured. So we can talk a little bit about that in the next conversation. So I'm pretty excited about that. But is there any so actually, can we talk about what Funk Weapon 1 is versus Funk Weapon 2?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so we have homebrew cultures that we sell, and it's not just local yeast cultures. So we sell Arlington Yeast. We also sell Chardonnay, which is a source from Chardonnay grapes in Walla Walla, Washington, and that's actually Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a really cool yeast strain. Arlington Yeast turned out to be a wild Cerevisiae strain, even though it has really kind of like lager-like characteristics. So we don't just do local yeast. We also do what we call the Dusty Bottoms collection, which is cultures that we've sourced from commercial sources, you know, breweries, lambic breweries, places that are not the same as the local yeast project. So Funk Weapon and Funk Weapon 1 and 2 were sourced from two different Belgian breweries, and they're two Brett Brux strains, and so they have very different profiles. They grow at different rates. They produce different flavor conditions. I mean, Funk Weapon 1, I would say, is more your classic barnyard Brett, horse blanket, your leather. Funk Weapon 2 is close to the tropical realm. I definitely recommend that for people who want to make a Brett IPA. So hop forward beers, it does beautifully. It makes that super juicy, overripe characteristic that I think a lot of people are moving to. You know, when you're making 100% Brett fermentations, I think a lot of people are really focusing on the tropical fruit realm, just because there's so many awesome hops now that really work really well with those. So I think that's going to be really cool, seeing your side-by-side comparison of those beers. And that's not saying the Funk Weapon 1 can't do great with hoppy beers. Ed Coffee from Ales of the Riverworks did a batch of beer that used some hops with Funk Weapon 1, and he really liked the results too. So it just goes to show you that Brett really has so many different aspects to it. You know, using it in primary is very different from using it in secondary with say a sack strain. You know, it really is a huge tool in the brewer's, you know, method of making cool flavors.
Yeah, I mean, a combination of the two would be amazing too. Maybe maybe blending, or maybe just straight up pitching both, create some really interesting stuff. That's what I really love about Brett. There's so many different qualities to it, and it's so easily manipulated. Temperature, like I'm fermenting these guys pretty warm, just because I tend to ferment these beers warm. I like stressing yeast out. Like I don't brew with that like DuPont strain unless it's midsummer here in Miami. I can ferment in my garage at 95 degrees. Yeah, so I really like stressing yeast. So I figured, let me do it, you know, what I'm used to, which is, so it's like 77, 78. I like pushing the temperatures up, so hopefully that creates something cool. But one of my favorite things, you know, for the past couple of years has been these like real big, juicy, tropical double IPAs, Brett, 100% Brett fermented IPAs. Because I think that Brett really plays well with the hops. So it's good to see that this Brett B is going to be something I'm hopefully going back to when I'm brewing my own IPAs at home. So you guys also sell like PDO, Sour Weapon, right?
Yep.
And, so, you know, potentially I could have pitched some PDO in with these beers and soured them up a little bit. Yep. Is there any way you recommend using something like Sour Weapon with a Funk Weapon? Or is it, again, just pretty much go ahead and experiment?
I mean, I always say experiment for sure. And like, you know, you shouldn't ever 100%, you know, do exactly what the yeast company says, because, you know, their goal is to make yeast that, you know, you use as one element of your brewing. So take the suggestions and run with them. Anytime we've released something and go with this kind of style of beer or use this way, you know, we always get multiple people who are like, hey, I want to do it this way. And I'm like, go for it, man. Let me know how it turns out, because I'd love to hear, because there's only so many ways that we can test out a culture before we release it. So it's really cool when people tell me what they're doing with it. I think Sour Weapon's really cool because it's not Pediococcus damnosus. You know, that's, I think, the pedio that most people are used to using. You know, it's got these hallmarks of, you know, a lot of diacetyl production, ropiness, which is the exopolysaccharides. You know, obviously it produces lactic acid, and it's a huge part of, you know, for people making sour beers, mixed fermentations. Our Sour Weapon is a different species of pedio. It's Pentasaceus. So really, in our testing, we haven't found a whole lot of diacetyl production, really no ropiness whatsoever. And so we recommend using it for sour warting or kettle souring, or however you want to do it, acidification of wort, because it really sours like a beast. If you can keep it relatively warm, you know, high 80s or higher, you know, you can really drop the pH to 3.2, 3.3, you know, in 24 hours, sometimes even less. So it's very aggressive. But, you know, what was cool about that, it was that it, you know, was actually, you know, wild caught. You know, that wasn't something from a bottle. You know, it's a blend of two different Pediococcus pentasaceus cultures. So one was sourced from flowers given to us by Art Whitaker, who lives just outside of Nashville in Murfreesboro. And the other was grown from a malt grain starter. And so together they're just a beast, and they, you know, they want to make you sour beer. You don't have to use it for kettle souring. You can co-pitch it. It does really well in a co-pitching scenario.
It's amazing.
So,
the best part about it is that the you know, so for people who have used pedio before, they understand what you're talking about, this diacetyl production. It's a pain in the ass to get past, you know, because you try the beer, you know, for the time, you know, you try the beer a month in and it tastes, you're like, wow, this is tasting really great. And then like 2 or 3 months in, you're like, oh, that's not even drinkable. Oh man. And the first time it happens to you, you think, oh my God, I'm going to throw these 10 gallons of beer away. But then you're like, okay, let's let it sit. And then 7 months in, 8 months in, 9 months in, you're like, ah, there it is. Boom. And then you go to bottle conditioning. If you're using the same culture to bottle condition, again, you go through the heartache of the pedio diacetyl nightmare.
Yeah. I mean, that's an unfun one. You're trying to pour a beer for a friend. It's like syrup coming out.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, the first time I was like, first time I remember pitching pedio into a beer, I was so proud of the beer. It tasted so great in the bottle after like a month. And I was like, you know what, I'm gonna hold on to them. I had some friends come over and they're like big beer geeks. And I'm like, wait till you try this sour beer. I poured it and it tasted like buttery popcorn. And I'm like, what the hell just happened to this thing? And sure enough, now 8 months later, it is tasting heavenly. But who has time? Ain't nobody got time for that, right? So, so what's great about this, and I haven't used it yet. I have some sitting in my fridge right now, but I hope to use it soon. But what's great about this is that you're saying we can somewhat avoid that whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, it is, you know, somewhat sensitive to hops and IBUs. So I definitely recommend using it in a beer that's, you know, 5 IBUs or less. It has a higher tolerance than that, but I think for most people, it may take too long to sour, or only drop the pH, you know, to close to the acidic range that people would prefer. But I think you could do something like where you know, quick soured, boiled, and then say use Brett as your primary fermenter, or you say you threw in the Sour Weapon first, and then threw in a clean yeast or a Brett strain, or you could throw them in at the same time, and it's going to sour very quickly and aggressively. And I think the cool thing about it too is, you know, I've heard a lot of people talk about the difference in acidity from lacto versus pedio. You know, I think a lot of reason why people knock, you know, acidification or quick souring is that usually it's with lactobacillus, you know, whether it's plantarum or something else. It's usually kind of one note. You know, it's got that like dairy, yogurty, you know, maybe lemony quality to it, and there's really not much there. But I think, you know, this is very subjective, but I think the Sour Weapon has a more rounded lactic acid quality to it. When we did some testing of it, when we did 3 different variations of using it, and the one we liked the best was actually quick souring, boiling, and then pitching a saison strain. and that one actually had these crazy tropical fruit qualities that I had never gotten from a saison strain before. I can't say I know exactly why, but it just goes to show you that different species of cultures can produce different metabolites that can be used by other yeast and bacteria to create unique flavors for you. So I haven't certainly tested every way of using this culture, but I think it's different and unique and fun to brew with, and makes tasty beers that are sour. So
that's awesome, because again, who wants to wait a whole year or two to drink a beer at home? We're not. Holy moly! So I hate it. That's awesome.
Well, it's also space too. It's like, how much space do you have?
That's the other thing. It's like you got to go back and tell your wife you need another 5 carboys, and where are those going to go, honey? So
you're already using the closet.
Yeah, exactly. At one point, my whole living room was full, and then it's like that was not a great month for me. But all jokes aside, it's awesome that we now have an option that we can sour a beer. One with PDO as a kettle soured beer. I agree with you. I tend to find that PDO gives you a more balanced sour, or a more complex maybe sour. It's less, like you said, one note. Lactobacillus tends to be just, it's acidic. It's nice and acidic. Yep. It's a clean sour. I think PDO gives you a lot of real kind of odd notes that are kind of fun to kind of decipher as you're drinking the beer, especially in conjunction with lactose. So it's fun to kind of pitch both. So we're going to do that. We're going to do the side-by-sides of Funk Whippin' 1 and Funk Whippin' 2 next time we chat. Hopefully it's not too much longer. Those things are fermenting away. They're monsters. I'll post a picture of that if people want to see that. I know that you now are doing, I guess kind of on the ending note, but you're now doing commercial size pitches, I think I saw, for people. And is that something that's available on the multiple barrel scale?
Yeah, definitely. That's been the hardest thing is, figuring out how to build a yeast company is really about how do you scale up yeast production. A yeast lab has to have a higher level of sanitation than a brewery does. You have to sterilize your wort, and boiling doesn't necessarily sterilize. You have to have a higher level of sterilization, so you have to use an autoclave or a pressure cooker. So scaling up those kind of things has been the biggest challenge, but over time we're figuring out new tricks and ways to scale up, and so we're actually now able to do up to 60 beer barrel pitches of all of our cultures. So the local yeast, the sour weapon, really making it available to craft brewers to experiment with and play with, and then also home brewers too that want to do like a club project, a barrel project. It's really simple for us to do a 2 beer barrel pitch of anything. John Hawking, the guy who sent me this beer, he did already asked for a custom pitch of his culture with our sour Solera blend. I think a 2 beer barrel pitch for him and his friends to make a Solera barrel that they can pull from constantly. So it has his local yeast in it. It has our sour Solera blend. And so, we can use cultures that you have, the cultures that we have, and make you custom blends to whatever you need. So that's the fun thing is, interacting with brewers and finding out, what they're interested in. Because craft brewers, vast majority of them start off as home brewers, and they have that same desire as home brewers to experiment, try new things, whether it's microbes or, some other new ingredient, and really expand what they can produce as a brewer and really just show, get the creative element out there. And so, I think they're in some ways, like you were saying, they are relying on homebrewers to kind of really show what can be achieved and brewing on a small scale. And then once it's done on a small scale, then they can scale it up. So it's really cool.
Yeah, and on another practical note of it, I think it's important because, I can see breweries like Forest and Maine who are heavily relying upon cultured yeast, or foraged yeast. Like I said, Jester King, Side Project does it, Casey does it. I mean, so I could see them being reliant upon someone like you saying, hey, safeguard this.
Yep.
Just in case I need it, just in case, God forbid, something happens to the brewery or something happens and the yeast that I'm keeping takes a turn, we've got it like, there.
Yep.
So
also, too, so, they'll have these mixed cultures too, and we can take it and determine the proportions of each of the cultures in it, and then prop that up for them in the future. So if they've got this mega blend that's just like, this is perfect, this is exactly how we want it to be every time, we can determine the proportions of the yeast and the bacteria, and then create pitches for them based on that. So not only is it distinct, but we can kind of like freeze in time that culture as it was, and then grow it up for them in the future. And so I think that's a cool resource too.
Awesome. So to find out more about Bootleg Biology, before we speak next time about the actual final product, which I'm sure will be just awesome, and I can't wait to drink an ice breaded Saison in less than 15 years. Go to Bootleg Biology and learn about how to do this. Buy the damn kit. It just makes so much sense to buy the kit. And then also play around with the yeast cultures. You won't be disappointed. Trust me, I've used Brett plenty of times. I really haven't seen it. The ones I've used, at least, haven't kicked ass like the one that you sell is doing currently and making a mess in my fermentation closet. So
that's our goal, is to blow your airlock every time. That's our goal.
Yeah, it's completely just destroyed. I think I sent you a picture of it. It's gotten uglier. So thank you for that. You're my wife's best friend. So, but no, honestly, it looks so healthy. It's just been really awesome. It's been behaving really well, and we'll do the side by side hopefully in a couple months. But until then, sir, thank you very much. I think it's been really informative. I'm sure people are going to have a blast kind of listening to you go through the process of how they can go and capture their own yeast and hopefully use the Bootleg Biology kit, which only makes sense, in my opinion, to use. You got to stop telling people they can go buy this stuff on their own. I mean, you sell it, for God's sakes. It's bad for business.
Hey, man, my goal is to teach and help people learn. And yes, please buy the kit because I think it's awesome.
There we go. Yeah.
Awesome.
Awesome. You even placed it conveniently over your right shoulder. So
that wasn't subtle at all, right?
So awesome. Well, thanks, man. We'll chat in a couple months, hopefully, with some really great bottle-conditioned Saisons with the Funk Weapon 1 and 2. And until then, if you guys have questions, please either forward them straight to Jeff or send them to me. We can talk about them the next time we chat live. It's been great. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Marco. This has been awesome, man. You have a good one.
All right. Have a great night.